1976 Cadillac Seville had fuel injection, closed loop, Bosch, O2 sensor feedback. It ran one wire to the O2 sensor, and it grounded the O2 sensors through the case. Now that system, all it cared about was 450 millivolts, which was stoichiometric, and it targeted it. When the O2 sensor cooled off, it didn't work anymore. It went open loop. So you were at open loop at idle, low speed, and a lot of the other times in operation. Well, as more reliance on emissions and tailpipe emissions became prevalent, the oxygen sensors became more and more sophisticated. They ended up grounding the oxygen sensors through the engine control module or powertrain control module. The reason they did that was an oxygen sensor works in millivolts, basically 0 to 1,000 millivolts. So that's a very small voltage, and it's very, very low current. It works in milliamps. And if you're just running a ground to the chassis and you have a 1/10 of a volt drop between the chassis and the computer, that's 100 millivolts. So now that reading is no longer accurate. It was accurate enough in 1976, but not in 2017. So what they ended up doing was supplying ground through the computer. They call it low reference. Now the computer can look at the internal low reference or ground and compare that to the O2 sensor. So if the ground on the O2 sensor floats, the signal will float with it, and it has a more accurate reading and feedback. And we now have heated O2 sensors. So these O2 sensors have to be up to about 600-700 degrees before they light off and really start to work properly. Now I'm not talking about air fuel sensors, which are 5-volt powered widebands. I'm talking about narrowband, the basic O2 sensor that's been used for the last 30 years. And when these things light off, they start switching pretty hard. And the frequency that they switch and the amplitude at what they switch is very important. We actually use the rear O2 sensor. We look at the amplitude to tell the health of the catalytic converter. In the event of a front O2 sensor failure, you can actually use the rear O2 for fuel control, and it's also used for fuel trim. So you want to run those rear O2s if you can. If you're not running converters, I get it, but if you are, you want to try to run those rear O2 sensors. So a modern, even an LS Gen 4 engine, runs what they call UltraFast O2s, and what happens as soon as you turn the key on, that PCM starts pumping amperage through the O2 heater. We're running heaters inside the O2. It gets that O2 up to temperature real fast, and then combined with the exhaust heat, we're looking at 700 degrees pretty quick. The O2 sensor starts switching. The UltraFast O2 sensors can literally switch within 10 seconds of a cold start, even on a cold day. Now compare that to 20 years ago where O2 sensors didn't switch at all, even at an idle, because they didn't have enough heat. So all these things are coming into play. Limp modes, failure modes, monitoring. Believe it or not, the body control module has a lot to do with monitors and adaptives because it acts as a power mode module. So when you turn the key off, the modules don't just power down. They do power down, but they do it in an organized way so that they can save the data that they have gathered. And this includes the transmission adaptives for shifting. It includes the spark, fuel, idle, just a host of other adaptives that have been learned. You would not have a file open on your computer and then just unplug your computer, because if you did, you would lose a lot of your files and data. So same thing with a modern vehicle. Now it's the body control module's responsibility to power down the network, and it could take up to 30 seconds. So that those adaptives are saved, and then the modules are shut off properly, so you don't go into a limp power mode, which could cause a draw and cause your vehicle to go dead. So all this is going on, and it's not simple like the old days where we'd throw a small block Chevy with a carburetor in and hook 3 wires up. Now, some of the manufacturers, I was at SEMA and I saw some of the aftermarket harnesses available for hot rods using LSs, and some of them were boasting 3-wire hookup. Even if you look at an E-rod harness from GM, they've got multiple power distribution and ground circuits. Yes, they cut a lot of the emissions monitoring and other circuits out, but the E-rods are not compliant in OBD2 vehicles. They're only compliant in pre-OBD2 vehicle, so it's a different level. And I look at some of these harnesses that are being manufactured today, and while some of them do have integrity, I look at some of the race harnesses, and they do run multiple grounds, heavy grounds, and do a really good job at it, and they run a race motor just fine at King of the Hammers. But that's a completely different application to a JK running on the street that's registered in California, that has to have failure modes, limp modes, and proper monitoring and proper power down. We'll talk more about this later. I know this stuff is kind of, I don't know if it's boring or if it's confusing, but after 30 years of doing this, it's become somewhat second nature to me. I had a Lexus recently that the dealer couldn't get the monitors to set on. I happen to know the customer from back when I was doing general repair, and they brought it to me, and CAM, or Keep Alive Memory, inside the computer had failed. So when you shut the computer down, it was clearing the monitors, and you couldn't set the monitors because you needed at least 2 or 3 drive cycles, but you couldn't do a drive cycle and key off, or CAM would erase the adaptives. So the lady needed a new computer, and then the CAM portion of the ECM stayed active, and she passed her test. I used to deal with the Department of Motor Vehicles used to send me the problem childs. I was a G2 for many years, and the early Mitsubishis and Hyundais had incredibly difficult drive cycles. You had to drive 40 miles an hour for so many seconds, and then slow down to 0, and then accelerate rapidly, and just all this stuff, stand on your head, and it was so difficult. Dealers were charging $125 to rack these vehicles and do the drive cycle on a rack. But the state stepped in and did the right thing and said, this is ridiculous. These customers purchased these vehicles. The manufacturer was not willing to change the monitoring, so they exempt those vehicles from monitors. And it was only for a year or two. There were some issues in BMWs and some other vehicles where in 1996, 1997, the monitoring was too stringent. So misfires, you get 2 misfires in a cylinder and a throw check engine light in a P302, maybe a P300, and you would fail your emissions test. Well, the reality is most modern engines only run 90-95% efficient, which means we're never going to reach 100% volumetric efficiency. We have intake manifolds, pumping losses. You could go to RAM intakes, and there's other ways to increase efficiency, but it's a trade-off because we're also looking at drivability and emissions compliance. So you're never going to be 100%. You fire that engine up on a cold morning, and you might see a couple of misfires. Well, the monitors will pick this up, throw a light, and guess what? You failed an emissions test. So BMW in particular got into some heated discussions with the lab here in Nevada, and I know in California, and ended up replacing a lot of PCMs and doing some reprogramming on PCMs to relax the misfire monitoring. Now today you can look at a modern scanner and look at the misfire data, and you'll see misfires popping up here and there, especially under heavy acceleration or cold start. But it's not going to throw a light, because manufacturers now know that a good running engine is going to have misfires, and they now include that. But in the early days, they didn't know that, and they just basically said, if this thing misfires, it's going to throw a light. And we've learned something in the 20 years OBD2 has been out. So when we do a swap, whether it's in a JK or a Toyota, these are the things we're keeping in mind. We're keeping in mind the ground distribution must remain intact. The power distribution must remain intact. We don't like to run 15 separate power distribution wires and a fuse block with 15 fuses and multiple relays. We don't like to do that. It's very costly, but we need to do that to get the functionality we just discussed. Can we eliminate critical circuits, critical grounds, critical modules? Of course. And on some builds we actually do that. We do that in off-road builds. We do that on builds where guys are going to run a buggy in the sand or whatever. But on a vehicle that I know is going to go out the door and the guy's going to take it to a lab or to an inspection station, we can't do that. And I have had customers with failures. I had a customer in Alaska where a coil had failed, shorted out, and the guy drove to a dealership in 4-cylinder mode. They hooked up a scanner, a Tech 2, diagnosed it with GM software, replaced his coils back on the road. Now, if he did not have the OEM monitoring and the OEM software and the OEM wiring, it may not have been as easy for him. He might have been stuck out in the road somewhere. So those are some of the considerations we take into our swap. And it's not the easy way, it's the hard way, but it's the right way. And maybe that'll shed a little bit of light on how we do and why we do things. And this also applies to the Hemis. AEV and some others tried to take some shortcuts with calibrations and monitors, and they got in trouble for it. And there's other ways to put engines in JKs. Some cut corners, some don't. So just do your diligence and just know that the way we've designed this from the beginning, and some may perceive it as, oh, it's extra work, or oh, I need better instructions because, you know, you've got these extra wires and you know, some of these don't. There's a reason for everything, and there's over 30 years of emissions and drivability experience that's built into our kits. And what we've learned is staying as stock as you can is the way to go. GM has spent millions and millions of dollars on these calibrations and testing and network configurations, and they have to make their vehicle run in Alaska, and they got to make it run in Las Vegas where it gets really hot, the same vehicle. So yes, you can tune your vehicle, get 50 more horsepower, but there's going to be a compromise because GM's done a pretty good job. This 5.3 I'm driving right now is 320 horsepower. At least that's what it's rated at. And I remember back in the mid-90s where the K motors in the Chevy pickups, which would be equivalent to this motor, it was a base motor, were running 180 horsepower, 190 horsepower. So we're over 100 horsepower more than that. And I've actually done a couple of 5.3 swaps in Chevy pickups where we took the K motors out. And the guys are just amazed how much better that 5.3 runs. More power, better mileage. It's technology is really an amazing thing, and we incorporate that into every build we do. So enough rambling for now, it's time to go back to the shop.